England's greatest theologian, Richard Baxter. When academics in reformed circles pose the question, who is England's greatest theologian, 17th century Dr. John Owen is named as the undisputed candidate for the title. That said, it is admitted that England tends to produce preachers rather than theologians. On this point, Owen humbly testified to his deficiencies during a conversation with King Charles II. When asked for his opinion of John Bunyan, the scholarly Puritan replied, "May it please your Majesty, if I could preach like that tinker, I would gladly relinquish all my learning." However, there is another who qualifies as 17th century England's greatest preacher and theologian, Richard Baxter. Accordingly, a 19th century scholar declared that he is the profoundest theologian of them all. I agree with that verdict. Furthermore, Owen has been called the Calvin of England. This is incorrect. Owen may properly be called the Beza of England, after Theodore Beza, John Calvin's successor in Geneva, who produced a caricature of key gospel themes in Calvin's teaching. Owen thus became a proponent of Beza's exaggerated Calvinism, known as High Calvinism. By his own testimony, on account of his middle way stance between Arminianism and Owenism, Richard Baxter may be called the Calvin of England. Of the great reformer, Baxter wrote, "I know no man since the apostles' days whom I value and honour more than Calvin, and whose judgment in all things, one with another, I more esteem and come nearer to." That quote comes from Richard Baxter's great work, The Saints' Everlasting Rest. A Christian man who, in the estimate of others, was ranked with the prophets, the apostles, and the church fathers, must be extraordinary by any standard. Such was the great Puritan Richard Baxter, who lived from 1615 to 1691. More widely read than Shakespeare in his day, he is one of England's greatest Christian preachers. His extraordinary 17th century ministry at Kidderminster in Worcestershire is celebrated by an appropriate local statue. A more significant monument, Baxter's nationwide influence was diffused by such still gripping page-turners as The Saints' Everlasting Rest and Call to the Unconverted. His lovely hymn, Ye Holy Angels Bright, is still enjoyed by modern worshippers. Neither must we ignore his colourful and dramatic life, as recorded in his autobiography, with its exotic Latin title, Reliquiae Baxterianae. Baxter also made a mark on English history by his courageous stand before the infamous Judge Jeffreys in 1685. Richard Baxter is arguably the greatest of all the Puritans, a giant among giants. As a saintly, energetic, dedicated, brilliant and large-hearted servant of Christ, he is probably the most effective pastor-evangelist this country has ever known. Certainly what C.H. Spurgeon was to the 19th and George Whitefield, together with the Wesley brothers, was to the 18th, Baxter was to 17th century England. A.B. Grossart wrote that Baxter is said to have drawn more hearts to the great bleeding heart than any other Englishman of his age. Furthermore, his pen productions proved just as famous as his pulpit ministry in Kidderminster. The sheer scale and variety of his contribution over a 42-year period is breathtaking, including his late massive scholarly Latin treatise Methodist Theologiae Christianae, 1681, and the earlier popular Persuasive to Holiness, A Saint or a Brute, 1662. Remarkably, many of Baxter's writings are still being published 300 years on. His style remains surprisingly lucid and lively, when most of his contemporaries are obviously dated. Baxter's books still retain their power to inform, arouse, and edify the modern reader. His message remains as powerful and meaningful as ever. Let me just give you some examples. Take, for example, Dr. Edmund Calamy, the champion of nonconformity, who became Richard Baxter's great publicist and promoters of his practical works in the early 18th century. Calamy was a minister in London, and this is what he said: "There are no writings that have more of a true Christian spirit, a greater mixture of judgment and affection, or a greater tendency to revive pure and undefiled religion that have been more esteemed abroad or more blessed at home for the awakening the secure, instructing the ignorant, confirming the wavering, comforting the dejected, recovering the profane, or improving such as are truly serious, than the practical works of this author." And then in the following century, Dr. Philip Doddridge of Northampton, who may claim to be another of England's greatest theologians, he said of Baxter, "Baxter is my particular favourite. I cannot indeed forbear looking upon him as one of the greatest orators that our nation ever produced. He discovers a manly eloquence and the most evident proofs of an amazing genius. His works are very proper for conviction. Few were ever instrumental of awakening more souls." And then a pupil of Doddridge, one David Dixon from Edinburgh. He later wrote to Doddridge in Northampton, "Such an author as Mr. Baxter, who is more excellent to me than all the dead uninspired authors, as you are more than all the living." For myself, after many years of soaking up Baxter's wonderful writings, this is my own testimony, notwithstanding the value of Spurgeon and Ryle, Lloyd Jones, and others. No Christian writers grip me like Baxter and Doddridge, especially the former. My whole soul glows when I read him. In a further video, I will make my case for asserting, for affirming, for insisting that England's greatest theologian is Richard Baxter.